Here in this lecture video, we're going to look at an argument by Gary Chartier that advocates of what he calls freed markets should oppose capitalism. This might seem a bit inconsistent logically. How could you say that one who's an advocate of free market would oppose capitalism? Because, typically capitalism is synonymous with a free market. Well, Gary Chartier here is going to try and argue why that's not the case. So first, Chartier is an advocate of what he calls a freed market. So he doesn't refer to free markets, but freed, and he means that in a future sense, that it is something we have to work towards, that we don't actually have free markets right now. We need to work towards free markets. And so in a way, he sees this as a kind of a call to action. So, there are three senses of the term capitalism, then, that he defines. Capitalism 1 is one which actually involves a freed market. So, capitalism 1 is an economic system that features personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services, right? So, this is the kind of capitalism that we typically think of when we think about capitalism, right? A laissez-faire system, what Adam Smith talked about, and so on. But although this is the common understanding of capitalism, he says there are two other definitions of capitalism that actually are opposed to this understanding of capitalism. So capitalism, too, is an economic system that features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government. Now, we know that this is how, capitalism exists now. There's no system in the world where there isn't some kind of a relationship between big business and government, where government doesn't in some ways regulate markets and businesses. And we also know that with the origins of capitalism, that the state played a central role in its emergence. So there's never been a time where capitalism has existed where there hasn't been this relationship between big business and government. Now, the third sense of capitalism, Capitalism 3, is where there is rule of workplaces, society, and, if there is one, a state, by capitalists. So where capitalists rule the workplaces, where capitalists rule society through economic power, and where capitalists rule the state, again, all through economic power, right? So that is where a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production. So in capitalism 2, we have a system where perhaps big business doesn't control the government, but the government and big business kind of work together, or at least government regulates businesses. Capitalism 3, though, is where governments are actually really in control. They serve the interests of capitalists. That governments don't, in Capitalism 3, pass legislation for the benefit of the average citizen. Instead, they pass legislation for the benefit of the big corporations because, perhaps the politicians there are paid off by the big businesses. So in Capitalism 2 and 3, free markets don't exist. Let's look closer at Capitalism 2. So Chartier argues that Capitalism 2 involves direct interference with market freedom. In this way, then, Capitalism 2 is inconsistent with freed market principles. He says Capitalism 2 is clearly inconsistent with Capitalism 1, and so with a freed market. Under Capitalism 2, politicians interfere with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services to enrich themselves and their constituents, and big businesses influence politicians in order to foster interference with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges to enrich themselves and their allies. So, under Capitalism 2, perhaps a big business a government passes regulations that, while they might serve the public's interests, like certain requirements about how goods can be processed to ensure safety and so on. So here we could think of, for example, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? I mean, there's actually kind of irony in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle where That text was originally published as a kind of call to social change for the conditions of workers. That, of course, ended up not happening, and what happened was the conditions of food changed, not necessarily the working conditions. But the point is, this was meant to benefit the public. It did benefit the public, right? The food produced in factories became safer to consume. But what it meant was some of the smaller businesses, maybe to compete with the bigger factories, they couldn't afford the kind of regulations that were required, the kind of methods they had to use to create the food, the safety checks, and so they would go out of business, right? And that ends up benefiting the larger businesses already. Maybe other things as well, regulations about, again, maybe government wants to protect workers, and that might be a good thing. So they pass certain laws about, hey, if you make a worker work overtime, you have to pay them more because they're already then at that point after 40 hours spending so much time away from family and friends and any kind of free pursuits they might have. So the worker then should benefit doubly, or at least time and a half, right? Well, in those cases, then it's clear that a market is not free in that anyone can just work for any wage they might freely agree to, but instead, in those cases, government is in some ways shaping the framework within which a market then exchanges of goods and services in a marketplace can occur. So because of that, then it's clear that a free market cannot exist with that kind of system where a government and business in some way work together, or government regulates business or whatever else. Now, with Capitalism 3, it's even more clear that it's inconsistent with freed market principles because it depends on past and ongoing interference with market freedom. So one can think about, for example, primitive accumulation and the fact that big businesses, think about like the BP, British Petroleum Company, that really depended on imperialistic Great Britain to have access to resources that made it a big corporation in the first place, such that it could outcompete smaller oil companies, let's say, for example, right? Well, that requires the power of the state. So the only way then you could have companies that exist now like BP is through the use of the state, through force, through imperial means. So as opposed to this, well, and actually we should say also, many times, a lot of times wars are started, for example, is to protect markets for those companies. So let's think of like the banana fruit company in Guatemala in the 1950s. So the banana fruit company had to use force when workers in Guatemala wanted to unionize, and the United States backed then the banana fruit company's use of force in Guatemala to prevent workers from unionizing, such that up to 250,000 Guatemalans were murdered by the banana fruit company to prevent them from unionizing. And Chiquita, right? The Chiquita brand comes from the United Fruit Company. So things like that are clear cases where the big companies depend on past and ongoing interference with market freedom. And maybe it doesn't even require kind of brute force like that, but we could just say like, let's take Amazon, for example. Amazon is so large, they're the de facto marketplace for online sales, where because most online sales happen through Amazon, as a small business owner, if you want to survive, you have to sell through Amazon. That means, though, you have to be subject to their pricing. And what they often do is price their own products lower than other people who are selling on their platform. So eventually you can't actually even, of course, survive. Even though you have to sell through Amazon to survive, it's actually only temporary. And in that way, they interfere with market freedom because they have become the kind of de facto marketplace where they set the rules for how things can be sold in the marketplace. And there are some ways in which then Chartier thinks a freed market differs then from those kind of practices that exist with Capitalism 3, where he thinks in a freed market, wealth would be widely distributed because you wouldn't have these big companies that are able to then use their economic power to then exploit others. So what he says is this would be the case where in a freed market, wealth would be widely distributed and large hierarchical businesses would actually not be efficient and they wouldn't be able to survive. Both of these things because, he says, most people actually don't like working in hierarchical work environments, and because flatter, more nimble organizations would be much more viable than large, clunky ones without government support for big businesses, where most people then, in a freed market, would end up working as independent contractors or in partnerships or cooperatives. There would be there would be far fewer larger businesses. Those that still existed of the large businesses likely wouldn't be as large as today's corporate behemoths, and social wealth would be widely dispersed among a vast number of small firms. So, Capitalism 3 depends on this past and ongoing interference with market freedom because there are certain kinds of privileges that are afforded to the politically well-connected that tend to make people actually poorer than would be absent, in the case of a freed market. So without the use of government to ensure, like for example, I mean, think of the fact that large companies often receive subsidies actually from the government that smaller businesses don't get because they've influenced politicians, right? And that means that laws get passed in their favor. So the kind of power that large corporations have that allow them to mitigate the ability for smaller businesses to rise up, for example, that this wouldn't be possible, Chartier thinks, in a freed market, and that means Capitalism 3 is inconsistent with freed market principles. Now, support for Capitalism 3, furthermore, is inconsistent with support for the underlying logic of freedom. So we see how what's required for a free market to exist, wouldn't, like the practices that happen in Capitalism 3 contradict free market principles. But Chartier argues that free market principles are based on an underlying, then, logic of freedom, a certain kind of freedom from coercion, and the freedom of self-expression, and the freedom of a positive liberty, right, or a Republican conception of freedom, where one is self-determining. That Capitalism 3 actually undermines, then, those conceptions of freedom. So Chartier thinks that Capitalism 1, where a freed market would exist, involves this underlying principle of respect for personal autonomy and dignity, where, as so often is the case in Capitalism 3, people have to perform monotonous tasks, right? So think about, again, in the division of labor, one is almost like a robot just going through the motions in a dehumanizing kind of way. Or people are alienated from their labor, maybe in a Marxist, conception here of this occurring. Or the case that just to survive, people have to take jobs that they feel are undignified, that make them, more like servants or other things like that. That in Capitalism 1, he thinks because people do pursue those things, those jobs would actually be more widely available in a freed market, whereas they're suppressed because to suppress those is more beneficial to the creation of an exponential growth of profit by the larger corporations. So Chartier says, those who take this view of comprehensive liberty want to see people free to develop and flourish as they choose in accordance with their own preferences, provided they don't aggress then against others. Proponents of this comprehensive liberty value not just freedom from aggression, but also freedom from the kind of social pressure people can exert because they or others have engaged in or benefited from aggression, as well as freedom from non-aggressive but unreasonable, perhaps petty or arbitrary social pressure that constrains people's options and their capacities to shape their lives as they like. So I think this argument he has here about the social pressure as well that is perpetuated in Capitalism 3 that undermines personal autonomy and dignity are examples like healthcare being tied to employment. I mean, the idea that healthcare is tied to employment is actually pushed for by large corporations. If healthcare was guaranteed as a right, then a lot of times people would not stay with the job they have that they hate, but they only stay with that job because the job provides health care. And of course, if you don't have health care, you risk, let's say you have a disease that requires monthly medication that's far too expensive, like insulin. Okay, you have diabetes, you need insulin. Insulin is very expensive. And would you want to risk leaving the job you hate, but which gives you the health care to be able to survive and get your insulin? Would you want to risk, right, quitting that job, maybe being unemployed for 6 months to pursue a job that's more meaningful? When you lose, in so doing that, you lose your health care and lose your guaranteed access to insulin to stay alive. Now, there's nothing that's directly coercive about that or illegal, but there's a clear kind of social pressure whereby, because for most people their health care is tied to employment, they actually aren't given that kind of personal freedom to pursue other jobs they value more. So Capitalism 3 then involves either violent and or nonviolent assaults on persons in order to maintain economic hierarchy. And in this way, then, Capitalism 3 is inconsistent with the kind of support for the underlying logic of freedom that exists, or that is proponents of free markets endorse. Now, why, though? Why wouldn't free markets say, yeah, but, all those cases, that's not real capitalism. That's cases of, oftentimes you hear cronyism or corporatism. Why refer to Capitalism 2 and 3 as capitalism? Chartier has some arguments why advocates of free markets should refer to Capitalism 2 and 3 as capitalism. The first reason is that they should do so to emphasize the specific undesirability of actually existing capitalism. That free markets don't exist right now. They never have. They're a goal we want to get to, but they don't exist right now. And what does exist is what is typically called capitalism. So we can say, hey, look, this is what happens right now, and everybody says capitalism exists right now, so we should just call this capitalism and talk about something else when we talk about freed markets. The second reason is to differentiate proponents of freed markets from vulgar market enthusiasts. So vulgar market enthusiasts are the kinds that advocate the system that exists right now and that say it's a free market and that, well, people should be, left to starve if, they feel like they need to leave their job that gives them health care to pursue, a better job or something like that, right? As where Chartier wants to say, no, we can have both a comprehensive liberty and a free market at one and the same time. We don't have to sacrifice it for a kind of cutthroat, free market approach. I mean, that's a pretty unpopular approach as well. So if you want to, garner sentiment and support for this vision of a freed market that Chartier is proposing, then of course it would be really important to distinguish that from, again, what he calls the vulgar market enthusiasts. The third reason is to emphasize that the freed market really is an unknown ideal, that we haven't experienced it yet, and so we can make changes in society for the benefit of everyone, right? To try and reach, maybe we could call it justice or whatever else, right? The fourth reason, to challenge a conception of the market economy that treats capital as more fundamental than labor. So it's often the case that in capitalism, capitalists are treated, they're more seen as more dignified, more respectable than workers. And Chartier wants to say, no, that labor is actually just as important, that's why strikes are so effective, that without labor, you can't produce the profits that capitalists receive. The next reason is to reclaim the word socialism for freed market radicals. Now, of course, he doesn't mean socialism in a Marxist kind of way. Chartier is not a Marxist. But he means to reclaim the word socialism and that, look, this freed market system should work for all, right? So this can be a kind of socialism, although a kind of socialism different, of course, from the Marxist kind. Furthermore, it's to express solidarity with workers, that when there are workers' movements or cases of unions going on strike for better working conditions, that freed market proponents then can actually express solidarity with workers and say, yes, right, this is an act of a freed market in progress right there, where workers are demanding better conditions, and they can do so because we shouldn't just say that, well, big business should be able to just do whatever they want with their workers. That, again, we want to advocate worker dignity. And finally, the reason is to identify with the legitimate concerns of the global anti-capitalist movement. So the global anti-capitalist movement, opposes things like, let's say, like Chevron oil spills in Ecuador, right? Where Chevron is such a big corporation, they can get away with, polluting whole areas of indigenous of areas of like Ecuador where indigenous people live, where then they suffer because of that oil pollution. And so this would be a way then to say, no, right, that kind of oil pollution is bad, and that is caused by the third, Capitalism Three system, or at least maybe even Capitalism Two. And that's why, he can say, look, we want a free market where then business that is done in a certain environment can't just pollute and harm the lives of indigenous people. That it should be responsible then to those people that have to bear the effects of it, right? And that a true free market would work in a way that it wouldn't just go and pollute whole areas of a society because it can afford the penalties, that might come with it. So for all of these reasons, then, Chartier argues that actually existing capitalism right now is not a free market, and therefore free market advocates should oppose the system that is called capitalism.